Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. It was the promise of money that lured me to the old estate. I was a house cleaner, hired by a wealthy family to clear out the remains of their deceased uncle's mansion. They claimed it had been left untouched for years, and they wanted everything gone, except for a few select valuables. The estate was in a quiet, rural area surrounded by dense woods. The mansion itself looked like something out of a horror movie, tall, decaying, and covered in ivy. The windows were clouded with years of dust, and the front door creaked open with an eerie slowness as I stepped inside. The musty air hit me instantly, thick with the smell of old wood and neglect. The first few hours were uneventful. I moved through the grand rooms, sorting through old furniture, collecting dusty trinkets, and clearing away cobwebs. But as I moved deeper into the mansion, I noticed a door at the far end of the hall that I hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, hidden behind a large bookshelf. My curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and found a staircase leading down into the darkness. The temperature dropped noticeably as I stepped onto the first step. The air was damp, heavy with an old, strange scent, something faintly metallic, like rust. I hesitated, but something about the basement called to me. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and descended. The light flickered in the cold, the beams slicing through the inky blackness. The basement was massive, stretching far beyond what I had expected. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of something I couldn't make out in the dark. I moved closer to one, and as my flashlight illuminated it, I realized it was filled with murky, yellow liquid. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was a strange, suffocating presence down here, something that didn't belong. I took a deep breath and continued exploring, pushing aside the unsettling feeling that seemed to cling to the air. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, half hidden behind a dusty tarp, was a large old wooden chest. It was weathered, with strange carvings on the side, symbols I didn't recognize. The chest had a heavy iron lock on it. Despite the unease gnawing at my stomach, I couldn't resist. I grabbed the lock, testing it with my hands. It was loose. I pulled hard, and with a satisfying click, the chest creaked open. Inside was a mound of old, yellowed papers, nothing too strange at first glance. But then, underneath them, I saw something that made my heart stop. A set of perfectly preserved human hands, severed at the wrist, the skin pale and stiff. My flashlight shook as I aimed it closer. There were markings on the hands, deep, jagged. Scars, as though they had been carved into the flesh. I stumbled back, almost knocking over the chest, but something stopped me. The sound, a faint scraping noise like nails against the floor, echoed in the basement. I froze. The noise grew louder, closer. I shone my flashlight frantically around the room, but there was nothing. Nothing but the jars, the shelves, and the darkness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or something like a person. It was standing in the farthest corner just beyond the reach of the light. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and its body was twisted in a way that didn't look natural. Its face, if you could call it a face, was pale, smooth, and completely featureless. My breath caught in my throat. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and the scraping sound continued, now unmistakable, its fingers dragging against the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My mind raced, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place. Then it spoke. The voice was not human. It was deep, guttural, and rasped with a pain that seemed ancient. You shouldn't have opened it. I barely managed to blink before the figure lunged forward, its hands reaching out toward me. Adrenaline hit me like a bolt of lightning, and in a blur, I turned and ran, not looking back. The stairs felt like they took an eternity to climb. Burst out of the basement and slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cool night. The mansion stood silent behind me, its windows empty, dark. I never went back inside. The family paid me my full fee, but I didn't tell them about what I found. I knew better than to speak of it. But even now, months later, I can still hear the faint scraping sound in my ears, like nails against the floor, and sometimes I swear I can feel its eyes watching me, waiting. I never planned on visiting the museum that day, but I found myself there anyway. I had been walking through the city, aimlessly, when I stumbled upon an old forgotten building tucked between two towering modern structures. Its faded sign simply read, Museum of Wonders. I had never heard of it, but curiosity pushed me through the doors. Inside, the air was cool and musty, and the lights flickered slightly overhead. There were no other visitors, just rows of strange exhibits behind glass cases. Most were relics I didn't recognize. Strange sculptures, old photographs, objects that felt out of place. It was quiet, too quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. As I wandered deeper into the museum, I found a section labeled The Unseen. The exhibits here were different, darker, almost oppressive. Behind the glass were objects I could barely look at, old books with pages that looked like they'd been torn from nightmares, paintings that seemed to shift when you weren't looking, and a large black mirror at the end of the hall. I stood before the mirror for a long time, unable to tear my gaze away. The reflection was oddly still, even though I could feel the subtle vibrations in the air around me, like something was just out of sight. It felt wrong. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. My reflection wasn't quite the same. It was subtle at first, a small flicker in the corner of the glass like the reflection of a hand moving when mine was still. But then, it became clearer. My reflection was grinning. I stared, paralyzed, as my reflection smirked wider, its eyes gleaming with something unsettlingly cruel. "Get out!" a voice rasped from behind me, deep and choking. I spun around, heart racing. The museum was still empty. My pulse thudded in my ears as I tried to steady my breath. There was no one there. Turning back to the mirror, I saw that my reflection wasn't mimicking my movements anymore. It was doing its own thing. Slowly, it raised its hand and tapped on the glass from the inside. I felt a chill run through me, and for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant to be truly afraid. Then, the reflection whispered, "You should have left sooner." Suddenly, the air in the museum shifted. The light above me flickered once more, then went out entirely. I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up just enough to illuminate the room in front of me. I could still see the faint outline of the mirror, but now, the reflection was gone. The glass was smooth, normal again. I turned to leave, but the hallway was different now. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lower, and the exit door I'd entered through was gone. Instead, there was another exhibit, this one behind a new glass case. Inside, I saw myself. But it wasn't the me that had entered the museum. This version looked terrified, wide-eyed, frozen in place. I could hear my own breath quicken as I stood in front of the glass. There was no mistake. The figure inside was me, trapped in the very place I was standing. I stumbled backward, hands shaking, eyes darting to the walls, looking for any way out. But the door was still nowhere in sight. The only thing left was the reflection of myself, staring back at me with empty, hollow eyes. And then, in the silence, I heard it, the whispering again. This time, it was louder, coming from all directions, coming from the glass, the air, the walls. Stay. It was the last thing I heard before the lights went out entirely. It started as a dare. A group of friends, myself included, had heard the stories about the old mall on the outskirts of town. Closed down for over a decade, it had become a ghostly legend. No one dared to go inside anymore. But we were curious. We were reckless. We waited until nightfall, when the air was thick and heavy with tension, and the only sound was the wind stirring leaves in the empty parking lot. The mall's silhouette loomed in the distance, a hulking mass of glass and steel that had once been the heart of the town. Now it looked more like a tomb. We crept through a broken side door, the hinges groaning like a low whisper. Inside, the air was musty and stale. The darkness was almost tangible, but the faint glow of our flashlights cut through it. The main hallway stretched before us, lined with the empty shelves of stores, signs faded, windows cracked, shelves abandoned. The air smelled of mildew and dust. "Let's just take a quick look around," Sarah said, her voice almost a whisper. "No one's been in here for years, right?" The others agreed. We wandered deeper into the mall, each of us trying to mask the growing sense of unease creeping up our spines. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting brief flashes of illumination before plunging us back into darkness. As we walked, we noticed something odd. There was no sign of decay. The building itself felt old, but the stores, the merchandise, it was almost as if time had paused here. Some shelves were still stocked with clothes, but they were pristine, as though they'd just been placed there moments ago. We passed a food court. Tables were set, abandoned meals half-eaten, and the smell of stale fast food hung in the air, despite the years of disuse. Something was wrong. I felt it, deep in my gut. Suddenly, Sarah gasped and pointed to a store window. A figure stood inside. We all froze. At first, I thought it was one of us, but no one had moved. The figure didn't move either. It stood perfectly still, its back to us, facing the mannequin displays in the store. Its outline was blurry, hard to make out in the dim light, but I could feel it staring through the glass. My stomach twisted. "What is that?" I whispered. "Let's go." "Now," said Tom, his voice tight. But before we could move, the figure turned slowly, deliberately. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The air turned, cold, an unnatural cold. I shivered. The figure stepped toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall, but the silence felt heavier now, oppressive. The exit was only a few hundred feet away, but with each step, the space seemed to stretch, as though the mall itself was expanding to keep us inside. The lights flickered again, this time plunging us into complete darkness. I heard Sarah scream. We fumbled for our flashlights, but they were useless. The shadows were too thick. Then, a cold hand gripped my wrist. I spun around, expecting one of my friends, but there was no one there. Just a low, rasping breath beside my ear. "Leave now," a voice whispered, impossibly close. I yanked my arm free, but the pressure didn't stop. I felt it pulling me back toward the deeper recesses of the mall. Desperate, I struggled against it, calling out to my friends, but their voices were distant, drowned out by the sound of my own breath, quick and shallow. Somehow, I broke free. I ran, not caring about direction, just about escaping. When I burst through the door into the parking lot, I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running until I reached the car, breathless and trembling. We never spoke of it again, but we all knew we'd seen something that night, something that shouldn't have been there. The mall still stands, empty and silent, every time. I drive past, I swear I see movement in the windows, a figure standing behind the glass, watching, waiting. It's always there, and it's never alone. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places. So, when I heard about the old theater in town, Closed for decades and rumored to be haunted, I couldn't resist. It was an impressive building, one of those grand theaters from the 1920s, crumbling but still beautiful in a sad, decaying way. The stories surrounding it were all the same. Strange noises, flickering lights, and glimpses of figures in the windows when no one was inside. I decided to go at night. I had my camera and flashlight, determined to get some eerie shots for my blog. I pushed open the rusted doors, which groaned in protest as I stepped into the darkened lobby. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew filled my nose. It was colder inside than outside, like the theater had been locked away from time itself. I took a few pictures of the cracked marble floors and faded velvet curtains, but something felt off. The place was too silent, unnaturally so. No creaks or groans from the building settling, just a heavy stillness that seemed to press in on me. I made my way to the main hall, where the old stage was. The seats were covered in layers of dust and the curtains hung limp, torn in places. The stage itself seemed untouched, as if time hadn't quite managed to destroy it. That's when I noticed the light. A single spotlight, dim but still faintly glowing, illuminating a spot center stage. I frowned, unsure if it was some kind of electrical anomaly. There was no power to the building. At least there shouldn't have been. I stepped closer to the stage, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. My flashlight flickered and went out, the beam sputtering before going dark. I cursed under my breath and fumbled with the batteries, trying to get it working again. As I did, I heard it, a low hum. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no. It was too steady, too rhythmic. I turned and found the source. A faint, glowing figure sitting in one of the seats at the front of the theater. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was human in shape, but its features were blurred, as if my mind couldn't fully process them. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. Instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my eyes locked on the figure. It tilted its head slightly as if acknowledging my presence. The spotlight flickered again, brighter this time, and in the flash, the figure was gone. I stumbled backward, breath coming in shallow gasps. My flashlight flickered back to life, and I didn't think. I bolted toward the exit, my feet pounding the floor, the hum still ringing in my ears. Just as I reached the door, I looked back. The spotlight was back on, but this time it wasn't aimed at the stage. It was directly on me. The door slammed shut as I rushed through, the sound echoing through the theater, and I ran into the night. I never went back to the theater, but I sometimes wonder, what was the figure? Why had it been there, watching? Months later, I heard that the theater was being torn down, and the workers reported hearing whispers and seeing strange lights at night. The spotlight was found again, but this time it was turned off. They said it never flickered on its own after that. Sometimes I wonder if that was the theater's way of telling me it wasn't ready to be forgotten. I was traveling home after a business trip, catching a late-night train from the city. The train was almost empty. Just me and a few scattered passengers. Nothing unusual. The car I was in was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting shadows across the worn-out seats. The rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks was oddly soothing. It wasn't until the next stop that things began to feel off. When the train doors opened, a man stepped in. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat that covered most of his face. He glanced around the car, then walked down the aisle, eventually sitting across from me. His eyes met mine for just a moment, and I immediately felt a chill crawl down my spine. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was staring. Every time I glanced up, I caught him watching me, his head slightly tilted as if waiting for something. After a while, I heard a sound, soft and faint. It was coming from the seat next to me where the man had been sitting. I turned to look, and to my shock, there was a small black object sitting on the seat, like a toy, but there was something wrong about it. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt wrong. The train jolted suddenly, making my heart race. I looked back at the man, but he wasn't there. I scanned the car, my breath catching in my throat. The man had disappeared completely. There was no sign of him, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Then the lights flickered again, and the train slowed as if approaching a stop. But when I looked out the window, the city was gone. All I could see was darkness. Endless, empty darkness. The train didn't stop. It kept going, but the sound of the wheels changed, becoming slower, almost deliberate. My mind raced. Was I dreaming? Had I somehow fallen asleep? I looked at the seat next to me again, and the black object was still there, now resting against the armrest. It had moved closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up quickly, heading toward the door to another car. But when I reached the door, I couldn't open it. The handle was stiff, unyielding, and it felt as though something was pressing against it from the other side. The train continued its eerie journey, and a cold sweat formed on my forehead. I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around. The man. He was back. Standing at the end of the aisle, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But this time, he didn't just stare. He took a step forward, and his voice echoed through the car. "You shouldn't have come," he said. His voice was low, distorted, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. "Now, you're part of the ride." I backed away, my heart pounding. The train was slowing down now, too slow, and I felt the car begin to tilt as if we were approaching a sharp bend. I reached for the door again, panic flooding my chest, but the handle remained stuck. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, the man was gone. The train screeched to a halt, and for a moment there was nothing but complete silence. No sound of the tracks, no noise at all. I opened the door, my hands shaking, and stumbled into the next car. It was empty. The next one, too. Empty. No passengers. No sign of anyone. I ran through the cars, desperately searching for an exit. When I reached the end, I looked out the window. There was nothing. No station, no lights, just a vast, endless void. I didn't know how long I'd been on that train, but it didn't matter. I was trapped. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I knew then. I wasn't just a passenger. I was part of it now. And as the train began to move again, I realized I would never leave. I'd been riding the subway for years, so when I got on at my usual station that night, I didn't think anything was out of the ordinary. It was late, and the train was practically empty. Just me and a few other stragglers, all too tired to care. The train rumbled beneath the city, the flickering lights casting long shadows along the walls of the cramped car. I plugged in my headphones, trying to zone out, but a strange feeling settled over me, like I was being watched. The car jerked, and the lights flickered again, a little longer this time. I glanced around, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the far end of the car, just past the dim lights. They were tall, unnaturally still, almost as if they were waiting for something. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. Maybe I was just tired, I thought, and tried to shake it off. But then the train screeched to a halt, far earlier than it should have. The lights cut out completely, leaving us in total darkness. A few seconds passed. Then a single light flickered back on above me, casting long shadows against the walls. There was no announcement, no explanation. Just a long, eerie silence. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps echoing down the narrow car. My heart rate quickened. There was no one else near me, and the others in the car hadn't reacted. They were too quiet, too still. It was as if they hadn't noticed anything strange. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, as if the floor beneath me had become sticky, pulling me back into my seat. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I glanced toward the far end of the car again, and my stomach dropped. The figure I thought I saw earlier was there now, but it was different. This time, I could see its face. Pale, almost ghostly, with wide, hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into an unsettling grin. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it staring directly at me, its eyes locked onto mine, as if daring me to look away. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to look around. No one seemed to notice. The other passengers remained still, their faces expressionless, as if they were all in some trance. My fingers fumbled for my phone, but the screen stayed black as if the power had been cut. Panic surged within me. The footsteps stopped. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward, and then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate. I could hear its breath now, short, raspy. Each step echoed like a hollow thud, each one louder than the last. I reached for the emergency stop button, but it wasn't there. The walls of the car seemed to close in, the air thick with a strange, oppressive weight. The figure was right in front of me now, standing just a few feet away, its smile widening. I could see every detail now. The uneven, cracked skin, the dark, sunken eyes. I didn't dare blink, and then it spoke, but not with its mouth. The voice didn't come from it, but from everywhere at once, as if it was in my head, slithering through my thoughts. "Don't you wish you were getting off soon?" it whispered. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My chest tightened, my heart racing as the car jerked to a start again, the lights flashing back on. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The train moved on, and I forced myself to breathe again. When I looked around, everyone was just as they had been before, distracted, unaware. The air felt normal again, but my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. The train reached my stop. I didn't look back. I stepped off, my legs shaking beneath me, and the doors closed behind me with a soft hiss. I glanced over my shoulder just as the train pulled away, and that's when I saw it again, just for a second in the reflection of the train's glass. The figure, smiling, watching. It was still on the train, and it was still watching me. I never took the subway late at night again. It was supposed to be a regular night shift. The office was empty, save for me and a few stragglers working overtime. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound breaking the silence, a constant drone that made the space feel colder, empty. I had been at this job for over a year, so I was used to the quiet hours after everyone left. But tonight, something felt off. The air was thicker than usual, and the cold in the room seemed to bite at my skin. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired. Around 11 p.m., I noticed something strange. One of the computers in the far corner of the office was on, its screen glowing brightly in the dim room. I thought I'd turned everything off before getting settled, but maybe I hadn't. It wasn't unusual to forget things when you were working late. I went over to shut it down, but as I got closer, the screen flickered. The words on the screen started to shift, the letters twisting and warping in a way that wasn't normal for any software I'd ever seen. It was a document, a file I didn't recognize, filled with rows of random letters and numbers that didn't make sense. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the weirdness. Maybe it was just a glitch. But as I tried to close the document, the cursor wouldn't move. It froze on the screen, the letters now starting to form words. "Help me," they read. Felt a chill crawl up my spine. My first instinct was to get up and leave the room, but my legs felt frozen. The words on the screen began to multiply, getting more urgent. "Help me, before it's too late." I stood there, staring at the screen, my heart racing. I heard a noise behind me, like the soft rustle of paper. My breath caught in my throat and I spun around, but there was nothing there. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, though the windows were sealed shut. The papers on my desk began to shuffle on their own, as if someone was rifling through them, though I knew I was alone. The air felt heavier now, suffocating. I tried again to turn off the computer, but it was as if it had a mind of its own. The screen flickered once more, and this time the words that appeared were clear. "You shouldn't have come back." A loud bang echoed through the room, making me jump. My pulse quickened and I backed away from the desk. The lights above flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Someone walking between the cubicles in the far part of the office. My heart raced. It was impossible. I was the only one in the building. I called out, "Hello?" No response. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing in the empty office. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. The footsteps continued, getting closer, closer. I could hear breathing now, ragged, as if someone was standing right behind me. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but it slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor with a thud. When I bent down to pick it up, I noticed something strange on the screen. A text message, sent from my own number. "It's already inside." The office door slammed shut, trapping me inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps were getting closer. The temperature dropped and I could see my breath misting in the air. I turned around to face the room, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the far corner, almost blending into the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its features were blurry, like they weren't quite there, but it was staring directly at me. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "You should have left," it whispered, its voice low and ragged. I bolted for the door, my mind racing as I threw my weight against it. This time, it opened. I didn't look back as I ran down the hallway, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind me, growing louder. I made it to the elevator, pressing the button frantically. The doors slid open, and I jumped inside, not caring about the floor. I just needed to get out. The elevator descended slowly, the lights flickering with each floor, but as I watched the numbers light up, I noticed something. The floor I was on, ground, wasn't moving. I checked the display again. It wasn't just stuck on the ground floor, it was stuck on the very number I had entered. 13. A voice whispered from behind me, soft as the hum of the elevator. "You're not alone." I turned slowly, but the elevator was empty. I was looking for something to do that evening, something different. When a friend mentioned the old mall at the edge of town, I felt a strange pull. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the fire, but stories still swirled about the place. Some said it was haunted. Others whispered that something worse was inside. It was around 9 p.m. when I drove up to it. The building loomed in the darkness, the faded neon lights from a distant sign barely visible. I could feel the chill in the air, the kind that always accompanies places people have left behind. I parked my car, the sound of the engine echoing in the eerie stillness. I stepped out, walking toward the entrance. The glass doors were cracked, the frames rusted. They didn't seem locked, so I pushed them open, stepping into the vast empty space. The air inside smelled of old dust, damp wood, and something rotten, like something had been left here to decay for far too long. The mall had once been vibrant, full of life. Now it was a hushed cavern of abandoned stores, broken signs, and graffiti. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows along the walls, and my footsteps echoed far louder than I'd expected. I pulled out my phone to take a few pictures. As I walked deeper into the center, something caught my eye. Movement. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. A figure. Someone standing in one of the dark store windows. They didn't move, just stood there, staring. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was a homeless person who had broken in to shelter from the cold, or someone else curious about the mall. But there was something unsettling about the way the figure didn't move, didn't blink. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I took a cautious step forward. The figure didn't seem to notice me at all. Its gaze remained, fixed on something in the distance. I hesitated but moved toward the window. As I got closer, I realized something. The figure wasn't inside the store. It was behind the glass. There was no reflection. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped back, my breath coming quicker. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from deeper within the mall. The kind of noise you only hear in places that are too quiet, too forgotten. I turned, scanning the area, but saw nothing out of place. Just the dark, empty stores. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A loud scraping, like metal being dragged across the floor. I couldn't help myself. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, pulling me toward the source of the sound. I passed through the food court, now a shadow of its former self, littered with broken chairs and shards of glass. The noise was louder now, coming from one of the closed stores near the back. I found the door slightly ajar, and I pushed it open without thinking. Inside, I saw the source of the sound. A heavy metal cart was being dragged across the floor, but there was no one near it. The cart moved on its own, scraping loudly as if it were being pulled by invisible hands. My pulse raced, my thoughts scrambled. I backed away slowly, but then the door slammed shut behind me. The cart stopped moving. I whirled around to find myself face to face with the figure again, the one in the window. It was no longer behind the glass. Now, it was standing in the doorway of the store, its face still obscured, its eyes locked onto me. I could feel the darkness around me growing thicker, closing in. There was no escape. Suddenly, I heard another sound, this time from above. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the rafters. I looked up and saw nothing, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. The figure in front of me took a step forward and I stumbled back, heart pounding. "Get out," a voice whispered from behind. The figure. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the darkness. The figure spoke again, its voice like dry leaves scraping against wood. "You shouldn't have come." I didn't think. I ran. My feet pounded against the cracked tiles as I bolted for the entrance. Behind me, the scraping continued, but now it was joined by the sound of distant, hurried footsteps, too many to count. I reached the doors, but they wouldn't open. I pulled at the handles, desperation building in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to force the doors open. And then, as if some unseen force had decided it was time, the doors flew open with a deafening crash. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped away. When I looked in my rearview mirror, the mall was still there, silent in the dark, but I saw the reflection of something. No, someone, standing at the entrance. Haven't been back to that mall since, but I sometimes wonder if the footsteps will find me again. It was an ordinary Saturday when my friends and I decided to check out the old mall on the edge of town. The place had been abandoned for years, but we'd heard rumors that it was haunted. We were young, curious, and, to be honest, a little reckless. The mall had been closed down after a fire, its charred skeleton standing as a grim reminder of its past. Now, the building was nothing more than a forgotten relic, filled with shattered glass, peeling paint, and empty corridors. We made our way, through a hole in the fence, barely visible in the dimming evening light. The silence inside the mall was overwhelming. No sound of people, no music, no buzz of life. just the echo of our footsteps as we ventured deeper into the heart of the building. I felt uneasy almost immediately. The air smelled of decay, like old paper and dust mixed with something faintly metallic. But the further we went, the more drawn I was to explore. The food court, once bustling with activity, now lay in ruin, vending machines smashed, chairs overturned, and tables coated in grime. It was then that we heard it, a faint sound like a child crying. I stopped dead in, my tracks, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, turning to my friends. They all nodded, their faces pale in the flickering light from our flashlights. We moved toward the sound, following it down a corridor that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The crying grew louder, echoing through the hallways, but we couldn't see anyone. Just the occasional flutter of a curtain hanging loosely from a window or a shadow that seemed to move too quickly. When we reached the source of the sound, we found an old escalator leading down into darkness. The crying came from below, but there was no way to tell who or what it was. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but I didn't want to seem scared, so I pushed forward. We descended into the bowels of the mall, the light from our flashlights, barely cutting through the heavy darkness. The crying stopped abruptly. We froze. Then, in the silence, something else began to move. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the bottom of the escalator. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were heavier now, closer, dragging on the ground like someone, or something, was pulling itself up the stairs. Then we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows at the bottom of the escalator. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated and wrong. Its face was a twisted, formless blur, like a reflection in a broken mirror. It didn't have eyes, just hollow pits where they should have been. The crying returned, but it was coming from this figure, the sound guttural and strange, as if it was trying to speak but couldn't. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot. My friends were equally paralyzed, staring at the figure in horror. It moved toward us, its limbs jerking in unnatural directions as it dragged itself up the escalator. The air grew cold. I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. Suddenly, there was a loud crash behind us. We all turned to see the escalator. That led back up, its steps moving, shifting as if someone were trying to climb it from below. Panic set in. Without thinking, we all sprinted toward the nearest exit. The lights flickered above us and the walls seemed to close in as we raced. Through the dark hallways, I could hear footsteps behind me, too close. Every time I glanced back, the figure was closer, its twisted form shuffling faster than it should have been able to. We burst out into the parking lot, breathless and terrified, not stopping until we reached the car. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, still watching us from the dark windows of the mall. Later, when we looked up the history of the place, we found no mention of a fire, only stories of a child who had gone missing years ago, and the rumors of something that had taken its place. No one had ever found the child's body, but we weren't the first to visit the mall. Others had come before us, and they never came back. I never meant to end up in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a brief detour after a long day at work. My phone had died, and I couldn't get a taxi, so I decided to walk through an old station that had been closed for years. I'd heard stories about it, the rumors that it was haunted, that strange things happened down there, but I didn't believe them. People talk, especially about places like this. I entered through a rusted gate, its hinges groaning, in protest, and descended the crumbling staircase. The station was dark, save for the dim light filtering in from street lamps above. The walls were covered in graffiti, faded and cracked. The air smelled musty, the ground wet with something I didn't want to think about. The platform was empty, just a few old benches and a cracked sign hanging crookedly overhead. The tracks stretched into the darkness, and for a moment I stood there, unsure. I wasn't supposed to be here, but the urge to explore pushed me forward. I wandered down the platform, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the emptiness. The silence was unnerving, and yet the place felt strangely alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the shadows stretching, unnaturally long. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like shoes dragging across the floor. It was faint at first, just a whisper against the stillness, but it grew louder with each passing second. My heart began to race. I spun around, but no one was there. The tapping continued, now followed by an odd scraping sound, as if something was being dragged along the floor. I didn't think. I turned and ran. My breath came in shallow bursts as I sprinted down the platform, my shoes slapping against the concrete. The tapping echoed behind me, quickening as though whatever it was had picked up speed, matching my frantic pace. Panic set in. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. Faint at first, just a figure in the darkness, but growing clearer with every step I took. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in a faded, tattered uniform, a conductor's hat perched on his head. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were empty, like deep, dark pits, staring straight through me. His mouth was moving, but there was no sound. I could hear nothing but the constant, maddening tapping. I stumbled, my foot catching on something, and I fell hard to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, hands shaking as I pushed myself up. When I turned, the man was closer. Too close. His face was now inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin. Then, without warning, the platform began to rumble. The walls vibrated, and the distant screeching of an oncoming train filled the air. I looked toward the tracks, and there it was, a train, its headlights cutting through the darkness, barreling toward me at impossible speed. I froze. It was moving too fast. I turned back to the man, but he was gone. The tapping had stopped. The train, though, was still coming, its wheels screeching louder with each passing second. I ran, desperately, with everything I had. My legs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. The train was nearly upon me, its shadow swallowing me whole, when I finally reached the stairway. I slammed into the rusted gate, desperately trying to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The train's light was blinding now, and I heard it, its horn blaring, deafening. And then, silence. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. When I finally opened my eyes, the train was gone. The platform was empty. The tapping, the rumbling, everything was gone. The station was as still as it had been when I first arrived. I didn't stay any longer. I stumbled back up the staircase, heart pounding, hands trembling. When I emerged into the night air, I didn't look back. I never spoke about it to anyone, but sometimes, when I pass the station on my way home, I see the faintest shadow flicker in the window. I haven't gone back. I won't. The invitation had been simple. Come explore the tunnels with us. I was always up for an adventure, especially with my friends, so I agreed without hesitation. I had heard rumors about the old underground system beneath the city, mysterious abandoned tunnels that ran for miles beneath our feet. No one really knew what was down there. We entered through a forgotten, rusted door in an alley behind a convenience store. The air inside was damp, stale, the smell of mold clinging to everything. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness as we ventured deeper into the maze of tunnels. The walls were lined with old bricks, cracked and moss-covered. Graffiti was scrawled everywhere, faded over time, but still noticeable. It was exciting at first, just exploring an old underground world. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the city above faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. We walked for what felt like hours, turning corners, heading through narrow passages, and finding nothing but dirt and rusted old pipes. Then we found the room. It was large, almost cavernous. with thick black wires hanging from the ceiling and strange metallic structures strewn about. There were broken pipes and debris everywhere, and the floor was uneven, coated in old, sticky substances that I couldn't identify. But what caught my attention wasn't the room. It was the shape. In the middle of the room, illuminated by our flashlights, was an old chair. A metal chair, bolted to the ground with straps hanging loosely from its arms and legs. It looked ancient, like something from another time. But what truly chilled me was the blood. The stains were dark, dried, and crusted around the base of the chair. It was as if someone had been strapped into it long ago and had never left. "Okay, this is creepy," one of my friends said, nervously laughing. We all agreed. I wanted to leave, but the curiosity still gnawed at me. I stepped closer to the chair, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something unsettling about it, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. I reached out to touch the back of the chair when I heard something. Just a whisper, faint, almost inaudible. I froze. The whisper was gone before I could make sense of it, but my skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. "Guys, let's go," I said, my voice shaking. We started to turn around, heading for the exit when we heard it again, a soft, scuffling sound followed by a low, guttural moan. It was coming from the dark tunnel behind us. "Who's messing around?" one of my friends asked, trying to sound brave, but his voice trembled. We stood frozen in place, listening. The scuffling stopped, replaced by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging across the ground. They were getting closer. "Get out of here now!" I shouted. We bolted, running through the winding tunnels, hearts racing, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The footsteps followed us, echoing in the dark, but no matter how fast we ran, they always seemed just behind us. The sound was getting closer, faster. Then we saw it. At the end of the hallway, a figure emerged, a shadow moving against the light, too tall, too hunched over, its limbs stretched at odd angles and its head cocked at an unnatural tilt. The light from our flashlights barely touched it before it vanished, swallowed by the darkness. We ran faster, barely thinking. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, the walls closing in, until finally we reached the entrance. My legs were on fire, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I shoved the rusted door open. We stumbled out into the alley, the city lights blinding after the suffocating darkness. We stood there, panting, too afraid to speak. None of us dared to look back. As we caught our breath, we heard it, faint at first, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. The whispering. It wasn't from the tunnels, it was coming from the alley behind us. "Get out, or you'll join us." We didn't stop running until we reached our cars, and not one of us spoke a word as we drove away. We never went back to those tunnels, and every time I walk past that alley I hear the whispers, "Get out." I was only there because of a dare. My friends had always joked about the old hospital on the outskirts of town, a place that had been shut down for years after a fire left it half destroyed. They said the building was haunted, that the spirits of those who died in the fire still roamed the halls, but I never believed in that kind of stuff. On a Friday night, my friend Liam bet me I wouldn't go inside. I hated losing bets, so I decided to prove him wrong. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way through the rusted gates and past the cracked concrete that led to the hospital's entrance. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. Broken windows, peeling paint, and the scent of decay heavy in the air. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get it over with. I pushed open the creaking door, the sound echoing far too loudly in the empty space. The flashlight's beam swept over the walls, revealing graffiti, old medical charts, and faded warning signs. The building was mostly intact on the first floor, but the further I went, the worse it got. The floor was littered with debris, and chunks of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving jagged edges above. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I kept walking. That's when I heard it. A soft sound at first, like a whisper. I stopped, my heart racing. I was alone, at least I thought I was. The whispers continued, growing louder, clearer. Help, me. The voice sounded strained, desperate. I froze. Was someone else here? Help me. It came again, but this time it sounded different. Closer. I turned toward the stairwell at the far end of the hall. The flashlight's beam flickered, and for a moment, the darkness seemed to swallow everything. Then, without warning, I saw a figure, a woman, her face hidden in shadow, standing at the top of the stairs. "Who's there?" I called out, but my voice felt small in the vast emptiness of the hospital. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she started descending the stairs slowly, her feet dragging, as if she couldn't lift them properly. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I should leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by faint sounds of crying. The woman's face was still hidden by the shadows, but I could feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice broken. "Please." I took a step backward, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the door. The woman didn't stop. She kept moving down the stairs, the dragging of her feet louder with every step. Suddenly, the light above me flickered, plunging the room into complete darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on, but it wouldn't work. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I felt around the room, desperate to find the door. And then I heard it. The woman's breath. Close now, too close. It was ragged, uneven. I spun around, my hands finally grasping the doorframe. The flashlight clicked on and I turned it toward the stairs, but there was nothing there. No woman, no shadow, just the empty space of the hospital stairwell. I exhaled, relief flooding through me. But before I could move, I heard it again. The whisper. "Behind you." I whirled around. The woman was standing right in front of me, inches away. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, like two deep black voids. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a rush of air that smelled like decay. The light flickered one last time before the darkness swallowed the room whole. I bolted, tearing through the hallways, my heart slamming in my chest. The whispers followed me, louder now, almost deafening. The sound of footsteps. Too many of them echoed in the distance, getting closer with every second. I didn't stop until I reached the front doors, slamming them open and running into the night air. I didn't look back. The next morning, I told my friends about what happened, but they laughed it off. No one believed me. That night, I checked my phone, just to make sure. The picture from the hospital I had taken in a hurry was still there. I had snapped a shot when I turned to run. I stared at it, confused. In the corner of the photo, just barely visible in the darkness, was the outline of a woman's face, her eyes staring straight at me, and it wasn't a shadow. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. My friends and I had heard about the abandoned mall on the outskirts of town. No one had been there in years. The doors had been chained shut for as long as we could remember. But we were bored, and curiosity won out. We didn't think much of it, but the thrill of exploring something forbidden drew us in. We snuck around the back, where a broken window offered an easy entrance. Inside, the air was stale, like it had been trapped for years. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls made the place feel even more suffocating, and the silence was so deep that even our footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. We wandered through the food court first. The booths were still there, some of them tipped over, others covered in dust. The scent of old fast food hung in the air, thick and rotten. But it was the mannequins that unsettled me. There were always mannequins in abandoned places, but these, their faces were different. Too realistic, too lifelike. I shook the thought from my head, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease creeping up my spine. After a few minutes, we found our way to the mall's central atrium. The glass ceiling above was cracked, letting in a few slivers of moonlight. The place was massive, silent, too silent. The sound of distant creaking echoed through the empty space like the building itself was alive and stretching. I heard something shift behind me and turned, expecting one of my friends to be standing there, but no one was. I frowned, my heart racing a little faster. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, looking around. "Just the wind," Mark said with a laugh, though his voice was tight. He was clearly trying to cover up his own nervousness. We moved on, walking deeper into the mall. As we reached the upper floor, the faint sound of something dragging reached my ears. I turned sharply. What was that? The others seemed unnerved now too, but we pressed forward, creeping along the second-story balcony. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving in the corner of my eye. I blinked, and it was gone. I called out, my voice shaking. "Mark?" But he wasn't next to me anymore. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. The others were gone. Not just out of sight, but gone, completely. I was alone. I bolted for the stairs, calling their names, but there was no answer, just the oppressive silence of the empty mall. The dragging sound returned, closer now, unmistakably behind me. I turned and saw it, one of the mannequins dragging itself across the floor toward me. The limbs weren't plastic. They were real, flesh and bone, though twisted and grotesque. The mannequin's head was cocked at an unnatural angle, its eyes wide open, staring directly at me. I screamed and ran. The dragging continued behind me, getting closer with every step. I reached the bottom of the stairs, but the exit was no longer where it had been. The back door was sealed tight, and when I turned, the entire mall had shifted. Hallways that didn't exist before stretched out in front of me. The food court, the stores, none of them looked familiar anymore. The dragging sound was relentless, closer now. The mannequin was gaining on me, its slow, horrifying movements seeming to stretch time. I tried to find another exit, but everywhere I looked, I was trapped. Then I heard the whispers, low, unintelligible, coming from all directions. The mannequins were everywhere now, crawling, standing, watching me. Their eyes followed my every movement, their twisted limbs moving in time with the dragging sound. I backed into a corner, my breath shallow, my body trembling. Just as the mannequin reached me, the lights flickered once, twice. Then everything went dark. I was frozen, heart pounding, the whispers now louder, swirling around me like a storm. When the lights came back on, everything was still. The mannequins were gone. I don't remember how I made it out of the mall, but I did. And when I looked back, the front doors were locked as if they'd never been opened. I left, and I never went back. I still don't know what happened that night, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the dragging sound again, slow and relentless, just behind me, waiting. I'd always wanted to spend a weekend in the mountains, away from the noise of the city. So, when I found a cabin listed on a rental site, nestled in the remote peaks, I didn't hesitate. The place was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. Just me, nature, and a few days of peace. When I arrived, the sun was setting behind the ridges, casting long, sharp shadows over the landscape. The cabin was small but charming, made of old timber and stone, with a wraparound porch. The air smelled crisp and clean, different from the smog-filled city I was used to. I was eager to settle in and explore, but as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that something was off. The interior was cozy, but it had that old, musty scent of abandonment. It was as if no one had lived there in years, even though the place seemed well-maintained. The furnishings were simple, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about the silence felt suffocating, the kind of silence you could almost hear. I spent the first evening unpacking, cooking a small meal, and enjoying the view from the porch. As the sun sank below the horizon, the mountain air grew colder and a fog began to roll in, blanketing the woods in a thick, wet mist. The distant sounds of animals, hawks, wolves, maybe, faded, replaced by a low, persistent whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was voices. I stood up from my chair on the porch and looked around, but the fog was so dense I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, like someone was speaking just beyond the reach of my vision. It was as though the trees themselves were talking to each other. I went inside, locking the door behind me, and tried to ignore the chill creeping down my spine. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know how easily sounds could be distorted in the mountains. But the voices didn't stop. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time I started to drift off, I heard a tapping at the window. At first, I dismissed it as a branch or the wind, but the sound grew more insistent, too rhythmic, too deliberate. I got up and peered through the curtains. There was nothing out there. I tried to go back to bed, but just as I closed my eyes, I heard it. A knock on the door. My heart pounded. It was nearly midnight and there was no way anyone could be out here. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. Nothing. Just the thick fog. The whispering voices now louder, echoing in the air like a distorted conversation. I closed the door quickly, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. But the whispers weren't just in the air anymore. They were in the walls. I stood frozen, the room filled with the sound of scraping like fingernails running along stone. The floor creaked underfoot, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and slow. They were coming from the attic. Hadn't noticed the attic stairs when I'd first entered the cabin, but now I couldn't ignore the faint outline of a door above the landing, partially hidden behind the old wooden beams. The footsteps were unmistakable. They were coming from up there. I grabbed the flashlight, trembling, and slowly ascended the stairs. The door to the attic creaked as I pushed it open, revealing nothing but shadows. The beam of my flashlight scanned the room. Empty. Just dusty furniture, forgotten books, and cobwebs. But then I saw something. On the far wall, barely visible in the dark, was a series of scratch marks. They were deep, jagged, like something, or someone, had clawed at the wood. The whispers grew louder. I turned quickly, my pulse racing, but there was no one there. The attic was silent again. I backed away, almost falling down the stairs in my haste to leave the room. When I reached the ground floor, the front door was wide open. The fog had poured in, flooding the room with its damp, cold air. I rushed to the door, slammed it shut, and bolted it. But the whispers, they didn't stop. Suddenly, I realized the truth. There were no other cabins, no other hikers, no escape. The cabin wasn't just old. It was alive, and it had been waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The voices continued their quiet, sinister chant, growing louder until they filled every corner of the cabin. By morning, I packed my things and fled, not daring to look back. To this day, I still hear the whispers when I walk in the woods. And I know there's something out there in the fog, something that will always be waiting for those who come to the cabin in the mountains. I was new to the job, a temp at an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They needed someone to cover shifts during the night while they sorted inventory, and the pay wasn't bad. I figured it would be like any other job, quiet, monotonous. The building itself was massive, a labyrinth of steel beams and concrete floors, most of it unused for years. The only section that had any activity was the far back corner, where they stored boxes of old records. The first few nights were uneventful. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, and the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only company. It was the fourth night that something felt off. I had just finished my rounds, making sure all the boxes were securely stacked, and I was about to head to the break room when I heard something. At first, it was just a whisper, a distant noise, like someone was moving crates in another part of the warehouse. I paused. The building was supposed to be empty. There were no other workers that night. I went to check it out, assuming I'd find a loose box or something out of place. As I walked deeper into the warehouse, the noise stopped. The silence returned. But something else shifted. The temperature. It had been warm when I first entered, but now it felt cold, like a draft was running through the aisles. I tightened my jacket and continued, walking deeper into the maze of shelves. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It darted across the far end of the warehouse just outside the reach of the lights. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Just a trick of the mind in the half-darkness. But then it happened again. A movement so quick and deliberate that I felt my pulse race. I wasn't alone. I hurried down the aisle trying to catch a glimpse of whatever, or whoever it was. The silence was now heavy, thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the row, in the deep shadows, there was a figure. A man, but wrong. He was standing completely still, facing a shelf, his back to me. His posture was unnaturally rigid, like he was frozen in place. I called out, "Hey, are you lost?" No response. I took a step closer, a cold sweat forming on my skin. There was something about him that wasn't right. His clothes were old, mismatched, like they hadn't been worn in years. I called out again, louder this time, but still no answer. As I moved closer, my foot hit something. A crate, but it didn't make the usual sound of a box falling. Instead, it emitted a soft, scratching noise, like something dragging across the concrete. I turned quickly, and then I saw it. The figure's head had moved, just slightly. His neck twisted unnaturally, like something had broken inside him. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The figure stood motionless once again, but I could see something else now. The shadows behind him shifted, as if something was hiding in them, waiting. A low hum started, too quiet at first, but growing steadily louder, a disturbing vibration that seemed to come from everywhere. The figure didn't turn around, but the shadows did. They were moving, sliding like liquid, extending toward me. I ran. My heart raced as I sprinted through the aisles trying to find the exit. I could hear the hum following me, growing in intensity. Behind me, the sounds of movement grew louder, scratching, dragging, like something was chasing me. I reached the back door. It was locked. I slammed against it, pulling at the handle with frantic hands, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. I felt a presence behind me. I dared a glance over my shoulder. The figure was closer now, impossibly close. He hadn't moved, but the shadows around him had reached the door. The floor beneath me started to shake. With everything I had, I shoved the door open and bolted into the parking lot. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in quick gasps. I glanced back at the warehouse. The lights were off. The building was completely still. But I knew something was in there, something that had never left. I didn't go back to that warehouse. And when I heard about the other temp workers who came and went over the years, I found out that not one of them lasted more than a few days. They didn't say it out loud, but they all knew. The warehouse wasn't empty. It never had been, and whatever was inside, it was still waiting. The hospital had always been quiet, too quiet. I'd worked there for months as a night shift nurse, the hours dragging in a sterile, empty silence. The building was old, with long, dimly lit corridors and rooms that creaked and groaned like they were alive. but I was used to it. I'd seen patients come and go, most of them with nothing more than the usual complaints. It was a job, nothing more. Or at least that's what I told myself. One night around 3 a.m., I was assigned to a new room, room 319. The patient was an elderly man, delirious and confused, his mind clouded by age and illness. His family had already left, leaving only a small, flickering lamp beside his bed. I walked in to check on him. His breathing was shallow and he hadn't moved for hours. But as I adjusted the sheets, his eyes opened. Wide, dark, and startlingly clear. He looked directly at me and whispered, "They're here. You shouldn't be here." I smiled, thinking it was just the confusion talking. "It's all right, Mr. Henderson. Just rest." But he didn't look away. His gaze was intense, and for a moment I felt an icy chill settle in the room. "You don't understand," he muttered. "They're in the walls." I chuckled nervously and checked the IV drip, dismissing it as the ramblings of a man near the end of his life. But there was something about his tone, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I settled into the small desk by the window, trying to distract myself with paperwork, but his words echoed in my mind. "They're in the walls." It wasn't. Long before I started hearing faint sounds, scraping, shifting, as if something was moving behind the walls. My stomach churned. It could have been the plumbing or old pipes creaking, but the sound was unmistakable. It was too deliberate, too alive. I stood and walked to the door, peering out into the hall. The hospital was dead silent. Not even a nurse or janitor in sight. The walls of the hallway felt like they were closing in, the dark corners impossible to see into. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the room behind me. I turned sharply, heart hammering, and rushed back into room 319. Mr. Henderson was sitting upright now, his hand gripping the edge of the bed tightly. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His fingers twitched as if he was trying to point to something. My breath caught in my throat as I followed his gaze. The wall behind him was rippling, the plaster bulging, in and out as though something was pushing against it. The sound of scraping intensified. My hand shook as I reached for the call button, but when I glanced back at Mr. Henderson, his eyes locked onto mine, filled with terror. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The wall. They found me." The wall gave a final groan, and before I could react, the plaster cracked open. A long, thin arm, skeletal, pale, and covered in black veins, shot out from the crack, reaching for him. My body froze. I couldn't move. The arm slithered across the bed, its fingers curling around Mr. Henderson's neck, pulling him into the wall. He gasped, his mouth gaping in horror as the wall seemed to swallow him whole, the plaster snapping back into place, as though nothing had ever happened. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. There was no sign of the arm, no trace of Mr. Henderson, just a perfect, undisturbed wall. In a blind panic, I rushed to the door and slammed it open, running down the hallway searching for someone, anyone. But the halls were empty. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second dragging on longer than the last. Finally, I ran into another nurse in the break room. I told her everything, explained what had happened. She didn't seem surprised. In fact, she looked almost relieved. "Room 319, she said softly. "You're not the first one. You won't be the last." Her words sank in slowly. The horror I had just witnessed wasn't new. It wasn't even unusual. The nurses, the staff, they all knew. The walls had been here long before any of us. When I went back to room 319, the bed was empty. The wall was perfectly intact, and the whispers, those whispers from the walls, started again. I didn't mean to end up in the old hospital. I was supposed to be exploring the nearby woods, following an old hiking trail I found online. But when I saw the crumbling brick building through the trees, curiosity took over. The hospital had been abandoned for years, the kind of place people whispered about but no one ever talked about in detail. I knew the stories. No one ever left once they were admitted. Some said it was the ghosts of the forgotten patients. Others claimed it was worse than that. The front door creaked open easily, and the air inside was cold, stale. Dust floated in, the weak sunlight streaming through broken windows. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, feeling a strange pull to keep going deeper. The floor was uneven, the walls lined with peeling paint, and everything seemed untouched by time. Frozen. In decay. I wandered through the hallways, photographing the remnants of the past. Old wheelchairs were scattered around, abandoned IV stands still standing in rooms, and yellowed medical charts hung on the walls like ghosts of patients long forgotten. I could almost hear the faint murmurs of voices, the distant beeping of machines, but when I stopped and listened, it was always silent. Then I found the staircase. It was narrow and hidden behind a door that seemed to have been overlooked. The staircase led down, deeper than I thought the building could go. The air grew even colder as I descended, and a faint scent of something rotten began to seep into the walls. I hesitated, but went down anyway. Something in my gut told me this was where I needed to be. The basement was worse than I expected. A thick layer of fog hung low to the ground, so dense I could barely see a few feet ahead. The walls were lined with old metal doors, each marked with a number. No names, just cold, impersonal digits. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing too loudly. Then I heard something. A soft scraping noise like nails on metal. I froze. The sound was close, very close, like it was right behind me. I turned quickly but saw nothing in the fog. My heart raced. Maybe it was just the building settling, or perhaps an animal had found its way in. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was undeniable. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw it. One of the doors at the end of the hall was ajar. From within came a faint, flickering light. I couldn't see inside, but the light was enough to pull me closer. I pushed the door open, my hands trembling. The room was small, nothing like the others. There were no hospital beds, no equipment, just a single chair in the center of the room, facing the corner. As I stepped inside, the light flickered again, and then it hit me. The air was thick with something oppressive, like the room had been waiting for me. The door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't dare turn around to look. The scraping sound came again, closer now, and it wasn't stopping. I spun around to face the corner. The chair moved on its own. Slowly, inch by inch, it turned, creaking as if someone was sitting in it. A voice, faint and ragged, whispered from the darkness. "Help me!" I backed away, my mind racing. My body was frozen with fear, but my feet moved on their own, stumbling toward the door. The chair continued to turn, the scraping noise now growing into something almost human, something clawing its way out of the darkness. Just as my hand reached the doorknob, the voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. "You shouldn't have come." I threw the door open and bolted down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The fog seemed thicker now, suffocating. I didn't dare look back. The sounds of scratching and soft whispering followed me as I ran, growing louder with each step until they were all around me. I felt the cold breath of something close behind me but didn't dare turn around. I reached the staircase and scrambled, up, gasping for air. The fog and whispers were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the building, watching me. I made it out of the hospital and into the fading light of dusk, breathless and shaken. I didn't stop until I was far away from the building, but as I glanced back one last time, I saw something in the upper window, a figure standing motionless, watching. And then I heard the voice again, clear as day, though it seemed far away. "Now, you shouldn't have left. I never went back to the hospital. but every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear those whispers calling me. I used to love going to the mall as a kid. It was the place to hang out, shop, and just be part of the crowd. But over the years, the mall went downhill. Stores closed, and eventually, it was abandoned. The city planned to demolish it, but the place stood empty for months. One evening, my friends and I decided to sneak in. It wasn't our first time exploring abandoned places, but this mall felt different. The windows were shattered, and the doors were left ajar, creaking in the wind. The air smelled stale with a faint hint of something rotten. It felt wrong, but we laughed it off. We made our way through the food court first, stepping over broken chairs and old, rotting kiosks. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead made everything look distorted, like something out of a bad dream. We joked around, snapping pictures, but something was off. The silence in the air was suffocating. No echoes of footsteps, no distant hum of the air conditioning. Then we heard it, a low hum. It came from the old escalators at the far end of the mall, the ones that had been broken for years. My heart skipped as I turned to my friends, but no one had moved. They were still standing by the food court, their faces as confused as mine. The hum grew louder, a mechanical whirring like the escalators had somehow started moving on their own. I felt an urge to check it out, though every instinct in me screamed not to. Slowly, I walked toward the sound, my friends reluctantly following. When we reached the escalators, we saw something that made my blood run cold. The escalators weren't just running. They were moving up and down, one after the other, even though no one was on them. At first, I thought it might be some kind of malfunction, but then I noticed something strange at the top of the escalator, a figure. It was a shadow, standing still just outside of the dim light. I could barely make out its shape, tall, thin, and unmoving. I couldn't see a face, just an outline that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. My breath caught. "Did you guys see that?" I whispered, but when I turned to my friends, they were gone. I looked back at the escalator. The figure was closer now. I could hear its footsteps echoing in the silence, but there was no sound. Then it spoke, a voice so faint I could barely hear it, like it was right beside me. "Why are you here?" I spun around, but no one was there. The mall was empty again. My friends, the sound of the escalators, the whisper. Everything had vanished. The lights flickered one last time before they went out completely, plunging us into darkness. I ran. I ran so fast, my feet slapping against the broken tiles, but every turn I took led me back to the same spot, back to the escalators. No matter how many times I tried to escape, the figure stood at the top, getting closer, its shape more defined. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The mall, the air, the silence. And then the hum returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the escalators, it was coming from behind me. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted, pushed open the nearest exit, and didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The city lights shone in the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows. I've never gone back to that mall. I don't know what I saw, but I know this. The mall wasn't abandoned. It was waiting,